Alright, here goes. I'm William, and this is one of those stories I never thought I'd actually type out, let alone post for strangers to read. I'm not proud of it, and I'm not fishing for sympathy either. This is just me putting a moment of my life under a harsh light and admitting I was the kind of person who thought he was smarter than everyone else. This happened a few years ago, back when I was juggling a low-paying job, a mountain of credit card debt, and a constant, low-grade panic that I pretended was motivation. The crime itself wasn't flashy, no weapons, no high-speed chases, but it was calculated, repetitive, and built entirely on trust. Fake receipts. That's it. Paper lies with numbers and logos that people rarely question. The motive wasn't desperation in the dramatic sense. I wasn't starving. I wasn't about to lose my home. It was worse than that. I was comfortable enough to justify being dishonest. My company had a generous reimbursement policy and a culture that ran on assumptions like, "We're all adults here," and "Nobody would lie about something this small." I saw the loophole before I saw the consequences. At first, it felt harmless. Everyone pads things a little, right? Gas rounded up, meals stretched, miscellaneous expenses that nobody ever asked about. I told myself it was a victimless shortcut, a way to rebalance a system that already felt rigged. But looking back, that's how every bad decision in my life started, wrapped in logic, softened by convenience, and fueled by my own entitlement. This is the story of how I crossed that line, convinced myself it was fine, and slowly realized that fake receipts aren't just about money. They're a game of trust where everyone loses, especially the person who thinks they're winning. The thing that scares me now is how ordinary the idea felt when it first clicked. I wasn't scheming in a dark room or plotting revenge against some faceless corporation. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, half filling out an expense report, while reheating cold coffee for the third time that morning. I had a crumpled receipt next to me, lunch from earlier that week. I remember flattening it out, squinting at the faded ink, and thinking, they barely even look at these. That wasn't paranoia or ego talking. I'd seen how approvals worked. A quick glance. A checkbox. Done. Nobody cross-referenced dates or locations unless something looked wildly off. That's when the thought landed, quiet and almost polite. What if the receipt didn't exist at all? I didn't act on it immediately. I closed the laptop, paced around my apartment, argued with myself like I always did. I told myself it would be stupid, risky, unnecessary. I also told myself it would be easy. And cheap. And fast. And just this once. The more I thought about it, the more it stopped feeling like theft and started feeling like a test. A systems test. Could I recreate something mundane enough to disappear into the noise? Could I make a lie so boring that no one would bother questioning it? That night, instead of watching TV or scrolling my phone, I Googled things I never thought I'd Google. Receipt formats, common fonts used by chain restaurants, how thermal paper fades over time. I wasn't planning a crime yet, I told myself I was just learning. But deep down, I already knew. Once curiosity turns into research, you've already stepped onto the path. And the worst part? I felt smart. Energized. Like I'd discovered a secret everyone else was too honest, or too scared, to notice. Before I ever made a fake receipt, I spent more time justifying it than actually doing it. That's something I've noticed about myself in hindsight. The prep work isn't the action, it's the moral gymnastics beforehand. I told myself the company wouldn't miss the money. I told myself executives wasted more on a single lunch than I'd ever claim in a year. I told myself I worked late nights, skipped vacations, answered emails on weekends. This was just me. Evening things out. None of those thoughts felt like lies at the time. They felt reasonable. Rational. Earned. I also convinced myself there were safeguards in place. If this were really wrong, someone would catch it, I thought. And if someone caught it, well, then I'd stop. That was my internal escape hatch. This idea that consequences were optional, that responsibility only counted if it was enforced. What I didn't admit to myself was that I was tired of feeling small. Tired of checking my bank balance before buying groceries. Tired of feeling like I was always one unexpected bill away from panic. The receipt wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. About proving I could bend something rigid without it snapping back at me. The night before I actually did it, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, but because my brain wouldn't shut up. I kept replaying the process in my head, imagining what it would look like, where it might fail, what questions I'd be asked if someone noticed. I rehearsed answers to questions no one had even asked yet. By morning, the anxiety had settled into something colder and sharper: resolve. Once that happened, the decision felt inevitable. Like I was already past the point of no return, even though, technically, I hadn't done anything yet. That was the moment I should have stopped. Instead, I opened my laptop and started preparing. Preparation didn't look dramatic. It looked like tabs open in a browser and me hunched over my laptop at 6 a.m., still in sweatpants, convincing myself this was just another admin task. I started small on purpose. I picked a mid-range chain restaurant I actually went to sometimes. Nothing fancy, nothing sketchy. Somewhere forgettable. I pulled up an old, legitimate receipt from my email inbox and studied it like it was evidence in a trial. Font size. Line spacing. How the subtotals sat slightly off-center. The tiny legal disclaimer at the bottom that no one ever reads. I found a receipt generator online that looked crude at first glance, but with a little tweaking, it was disturbingly close. I swapped fonts, adjusted dates, nudged prices up just enough to look normal. Not too round. Not too clean. I even added tax down to the cent because sloppiness felt riskier than complexity. The weirdest part was how much care I put into making it imperfect. I lowered the resolution slightly so it wouldn't look too digital. I printed it, crumpled it once, flattened it back out, then scanned it again. I remember laughing under my breath when I realized I was basically role-playing a careless version of myself. I tested the workflow like it was a rehearsal. Upload receipt. Attach to expense report. Add a neutral description. Client lunch. No names. No stories. Boring was the goal. Boring slides through. Before submitting, I stared at the screen for a long time. My finger hovered over the trackpad like it weighed 100 pounds. This wasn't adrenaline yet, it was a tight, buzzing pressure behind my eyes. The kind that makes you hyper-aware of your heartbeat. I told myself, if this works, I'll stop. That lie came easily. Easier than the receipt itself. Then I clicked submit. For the rest of the day, every email notification made my stomach flip. Every Slack message felt like a summons. I kept waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. And that silence? That was the most dangerous part of all. The approval came 2 days later. No comment. No question. Just a quiet notification telling me the reimbursement had been processed. I remember reading it 3 times, like the words might rearrange themselves into an accusation if I blinked wrong. When the money hit my account, it didn't feel like winning. It felt surreal. Like the universe had glitched and accidentally rewarded me for lying. I checked my balance again and again, half expecting it to reverse itself. It didn't. That night, I bought groceries without calculating every item. I filled my gas tank all the way instead of stopping at a number that felt safe. Those tiny freedoms felt intoxicating. Not because they were extravagant, but because they were effortless. I hadn't earned them, yet there they were. At the same time, something else crept in, a subtle shift in how I saw the system. It hadn't caught me. Which meant, in my twisted logic, it had approved me. The rules suddenly felt optional, like suggestions instead of boundaries. That was the moment the crime stopped being an experiment and started becoming a habit, even though I didn't have the courage to admit that yet. Once the first one went through, the fear didn't disappear, it evolved. It became quieter, more manageable, like background noise you learn to ignore. That scared me more than the initial panic ever did. I didn't rush into the second fake receipt. I waited. A week. Then 2. I wanted distance, proof this wasn't compulsive. In my head, patience equaled control. When I finally did it again, I changed things slightly. Different restaurant. Different day. Different amount. I told myself patterns were what got people caught, and I was too smart to leave one. I started keeping notes, not written down, but mentally. Average meal prices. How often coworkers submitted expenses. Which managers approved faster, and which ones skimmed. It felt less like stealing and more like optimizing a process, which is a dangerous way to frame anything unethical. The weird part was how normal it became. I'd fake a receipt in the morning, then jump on a meeting like nothing had happened. Joke with coworkers. Talk about weekend plans. No one knew I was quietly crossing a line again. Each success made the next step easier. And each step pushed the old version of me a little further out of reach. By the third or fourth fake receipt, I stopped thinking of them as fake. They were just receipts. That's the mental trick that really sealed it for me. Once the word fake disappears, so does most of the guilt. I got bolder, but not reckless. I started adding variety, coffee meetings, parking fees, small travel meals. Nothing over the reimbursement cap, nothing that would trigger an extra approval. I spaced them out carefully, like I was dosing myself. Too much too fast felt dangerous. Moderation, I told myself, was responsibility. What I didn't expect was how much mental energy it took. I was constantly cross-checking my own lies. Did I already use that restaurant last month? Was I supposedly out of town that day? I wasn't keeping a spreadsheet, but my brain felt like one, tabs always open, never fully closing. There were moments during meetings when someone would mention expenses casually, and my chest would tighten. Not because they suspected anything, but because I suddenly remembered how much I'd fabricated. The lies weren't just on paper anymore, they were living in my head. Still, nothing happened. No emails. No audits. Just silence, and my growing confidence filling it. The first crack didn't come from accounting. It came from a coworker named Jenna during a completely normal afternoon. We were talking about travel reimbursements, just casual complaining, when she laughed and said, "I swear, if I didn't have receipts I'd be broke. There's such a pain." My stomach dropped. Not because she accused me, she didn't, but because I suddenly became hyper-aware of how easily this whole thing could come up. One offhand comment. One shared story. One misplaced assumption. I laughed along, nodded, added something neutral, but my pulse was pounding. After that, I started second-guessing everything. I reread old submissions, checking for inconsistencies that probably only existed in my head. I imagined audits that weren't scheduled and emails that hadn't been written yet. At night, I'd replay conversations, wondering if I'd said too much or too little. Ironically, the stress made me more dependent on the money. The fake receipts had quietly become part of my budgeting. Removing them felt like cutting a support beam I'd stupidly built my life around. That's when I realized I wasn't in control anymore. I was maintaining something fragile, and I knew it. The closest I came to getting caught started with a calendar invite. Expense policy review, mandatory. No agenda. No explanation. Just a 30-minute block that sat on my schedule like a threat. I spent the entire morning spiraling. Every fake receipt I'd ever submitted replayed in my head in high definition. I imagined someone sharing their screen, pulling up my name, zooming in on inconsistencies I'd somehow missed. I even drafted a resignation email I never sent, just in case panic made me do something stupid. The meeting itself was painfully ordinary. A new compliance initiative. Random audits. Nothing to worry about if your documentation is accurate. That sentence hit me like a physical blow. I nodded along, took notes I didn't need, and tried to keep my face neutral while my hands went cold. Afterward, I didn't fake any receipts for a while. I told myself this was the end, that the universe had given me a warning shot. But fear fades. Bills don't. A month later, I submitted another one, smaller than usual, justified in my head as a taper, not a relapse. That's the lie I told myself right before things started unraveling. What finally betrayed me wasn't a single mistake. It was repetition. Humans are terrible at spotting one-off anomalies, but we're surprisingly good at sensing rhythm. And I had one, whether I wanted to admit it or not. An email landed in my inbox from accounting. Polite. Neutral. 3 sentences asking me to clarify a few expense submissions from the past quarter. No accusations. No red flags. Just a request. Somehow that was worse. If they were angry, I could brace for impact. This felt like being invited into a quiet room. I spent hours crafting explanations that sounded casual but not defensive. I matched each receipt to a plausible memory. Client meeting. Delayed train. Long day. I even convinced myself some of them were true, or close enough to count. When I finally replied, my hands were shaking. Waiting for the response felt unbearable. I jumped every time my inbox refreshed. I stopped sleeping properly. The money I'd taken no longer felt like relief, it felt like weight. For the first time, I seriously considered confessing. Not because it was right, but because I was exhausted from pretending I was fine. They asked me to hop on a call. Just a quick sync, they said. 30 minutes. I stared at the invite like it might blink first. This was it, the moment where all my careful boringness finally collapsed into something undeniable. The call started exactly how you'd expect, pleasantries, weather, thanks for my time. Then silence. The kind that stretches just long enough to make you feel it if you're nervous. I didn't. I waited. That felt like the only control I had left. They shared their screen. A spreadsheet. My name highlighted more than once. Not every receipt. Just enough to establish a pattern. Similar amounts. Similar timing. Different vendors. It wasn't proof, but it was pressure. They asked me to explain. Not accuse. Explain. I talked. Slowly. Carefully. I heard myself lying and hated how practiced it sounded. Halfway through, I realized something worse than being caught. They didn't need a confession. They needed me to keep talking until I trapped myself. When the call ended, they said they'd follow up. I sat there long after, heart pounding, knowing whatever came next would define how this ended. The days after that call were some of the longest of my life. No follow-up. No emails. Just silence that felt deliberate, like they were letting me stew in my own thoughts. Every notification made my chest tighten. Every unknown number felt like a verdict. I replayed the call obsessively. Wondered which sentence sounded weakest, which pause lingered too long. I debated preemptively confessing, then talked myself out of it. Confession felt irreversible. Silence still gave me the illusion of options. I started preparing for damage control. I checked my savings, calculated how long I could survive if I was fired. I updated my resume at midnight, deleting and retyping the same bullet points because I couldn't focus. I even rehearsed conversations with friends that might never happen, practicing how vague I could be without lying outright. What surprised me most was the guilt. Not fear, guilt. Faces of coworkers kept popping into my head. People who trusted the system because they trusted each other. I treated that trust like background noise. By the end of the week, I realized something had already changed. Whether I was caught or not, I couldn't unknow what I'd become while waiting. The follow-up finally came on a Friday afternoon, which felt intentional. A short email asking me to meet with HR and finance. No drama. No urgency. Just confirmation that the waiting was over. The meeting itself was calm in a way that felt almost cruel. They laid it out plainly: discrepancies, insufficient verification, a loss of confidence. They didn't say the word fraud, but it hovered in the room like a bad smell everyone pretended not to notice. I was given a choice: resign quietly or let them escalate it internally. No police. No courtroom. just consequences contained within the company. I chose to resign. Not because it was noble, but because it was survivable. Walking out of that building for the last time felt unreal. I kept expecting someone to stop me, to demand answers, to make a scene. No one did. I handed in my badge, nodded at the security desk, and stepped outside like any other employee on their last day. I'd gotten away legally. Professionally? Not even close. The weeks after I left were quieter than I expected. No dramatic fallout. No calls from lawyers. Just a sudden absence of structure. My days stretched out in uncomfortable ways, giving me too much time to think. I told people I'd left for personal reasons. Technically true. No one pushed. Most people don't want details when the answer might make things awkward. I was grateful and ashamed in equal measure. Financially, I was worse off, but clearer. Without the fake reimbursements propping me up, I had to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. I cut expenses. Sold things. Took freelance work I previously dismissed as beneath me. None of it felt good, but it felt honest. Emotionally, it was messy. Relief tangled with regret. I'd escaped the worst-case scenario, yet the cost was still real. I'd lost trust one couldn't list on a resume. Lost confidence in my own judgment. The strangest part was how ordinary everything looked from the outside. No one saw the internal shift. But I did. I knew I couldn't go back to being the person who thought small lies stayed small forever. I'm writing this now because enough time has passed that I can see the shape of it clearly. What I did wasn't clever, and it wasn't harmless. It was slow erosion, of trust, of self-respect, of the version of me that used to believe I had lines I wouldn't cross. Fake receipts taught me something uncomfortable. Crimes don't always feel like crimes when you're inside them. They feel like routines. Like shortcuts. Like temporary solutions that quietly turn permanent. And the system doesn't have to explode for damage to be done. Sometimes it just adjusts, absorbs the loss, and lets you carry it instead. If you're reading this and thinking about doing something similar, my advice is simple and unglamorous: don't. Not because you'll definitely get caught, but because you'll start lying to yourself in ways that don't stop when the behavior does. The money disappears. The justification doesn't. I got away on paper. But I still paid. And I'm still paying, just in ways that don't show up on a balance sheet.